The year 2025 began with a chill between the United States and Canada. Not from winter, but from President Donald Trump's fiery rhetoric. The world watched as tensions simmered, and the familiar warmth between the two neighbors seemed to vanish overnight. Trump threatened a sweeping 25% tariff on all Canadian goods, shaking the global economy and hitting Canada hardest. Markets tumbled, and uncertainty rippled through boardrooms and households alike as businesses scrambled to assess the fallout. The threats targeted everything from lumber to agriculture, seen by Canadians as an attack on their sovereignty and stability. For many, it felt like a direct challenge to their way of life, with rural communities and family farms bracing for impact. Trump's language escalated, even hinting at economic annexation, sparking outrage across Canada. Protests erupted in major cities, and social media buzzed with calls for resistance and unity. Canadian leaders scrambled to respond, realizing the partnership was on the brink of collapse. Emergency meetings were held, and Prime Minister Trudeau addressed the nation, urging calm but preparing for tough negotiations ahead. The clash was more than numbers. It was a battle of ideologies. America first versus Canada's commitment to cooperation. The two countries, once close allies, now found themselves at a crossroads, their values and priorities in stark contrast. Canadians saw the tariffs as a betrayal of shared values, threatening the very foundation of the North American alliance. The future of trade, and even the spirit of partnership, suddenly seemed uncertain. As Trump doubled down, it became clear that quiet diplomacy wouldn't suffice. The usual back channels and polite negotiations were no match for the public spectacle unfolding. A sense of unity formed in Canada, determined to stand firm against what they saw as bullying tactics. Communities rallied together, vowing to protect their industries and national pride. The stage was set for a dramatic and unprecedented showdown, with the world watching to see which nation would blink first. British Columbia became the front line of Canada's resistance, stepping into a pivotal role as tensions with the United States escalated over trade policy. With Premier David Eby Economic Stabilization Tariff Response Act, the province signaled it was ready to defend Canadian interests with bold new measures. The act granted BC the unprecedented power to impose tolls on all traffic to and from Alaska, leveraging its unique position as the only land bridge connecting Alaska to the rest of the US mainland. This wasn't just a threat, it was a calculated move, a strategic bargaining chip ready to be deployed if US tariffs on Canadian goods materialized. The message was clear: disrupt us, and we'll disrupt your access to Alaska, a lifeline for both people and goods. The Alaska Highway is vital for commerce and travel. The mere prospect of tolls sent shockwaves through Alaskan communities and politicians alike, raising fears of economic isolation. The legislation specifically targeted commercial vehicles, which form the backbone of Alaska's supply chain, transporting everything from food to fuel. But it also left open the possibility of tolls for all vehicles, creating a cloud of uncertainty for everyday travelers and families who rely on the highway. Alaska's supply chain was effectively held hostage, a reality not lost on either side of the border. The threat of tolls meant potential shortages and higher prices for Alaskans. Premier Eby called it a reluctant but necessary step, emphasizing that the hope was tolls would never actually be needed, but that BC had to be prepared. The act was temporary, set to expire in 2027, signaling it was a tool for negotiation, not a permanent barrier, and leaving the door open for future diplomacy. Canada had drawn a clear line in the sand, making it known that it would defend its interests, even if it meant taking drastic measures. President Trump's response was immediate and furious, condemning Canada's move as a disgraceful shakedown. He vowed overwhelming retaliation, enlisting Congress to craft a counterstrike. Senator Dan Sullivan of Alaska threatened to waive the Passenger Vessel Services Act, allowing cruise ships to bypass BC ports. This would devastate BC's tourism industry, which relies on nearly 2 million cruise passengers each summer. The threat targeted thousands of jobs and billions in revenue, showing the US had leverage too. The economic threats escalated, with livelihoods in both Alaska and BC caught in the crossfire. The diplomatic atmosphere soured, making resolutions seem distant. Trump's administration framed the conflict as a test of national strength, refusing to de-escalate. US officials warned of overwhelming force if Canada acted. The standoff became a high-stakes game of chicken, with suspicion replacing decades of cooperation. The world's longest undefended border was now a front line of economic warfare. The threat of tolls on the Alaska Highway sent shockwaves through Alaska, exposing its vulnerability. While most cargo arrives by sea, trucks are essential for time-sensitive goods, fresh food, dairy, and critical supplies. Disruption would mean higher costs and potential shortages, alarming consumers and businesses. Alaska's oil and gas industry, dependent on overland shipments, faced costly delays. State Senator Robert Myers, also a trucker, warned tolls would be a tax on every Alaskan. The Alaska Trucking Association projected thousands in added costs per truckload, with expenses passed to consumers. The uncertainty chilled commerce and investment, highlighting the deep interdependence of the two economies. The highway, once a symbol of connection, now represented division and economic anxiety. BC's highway tolls were part of a broader Team Canada strategy, a united national front against US protectionism. The move wasn't just about raising revenue, it was a clear signal that Canada was willing to take bold, coordinated action to defend its interests. Across the country, leaders and citizens alike recognized the need to stand together in the face of mounting American tariffs. Prime Minister Trudeau announced retaliatory tariffs on American goods, signaling Canada wouldn't back down. His message was firm. Canada would not be bullied, and every measure would be considered to protect Canadian jobs and industries. Provincial premiers joined in. Ontario imposed a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to the US, targeting states reliant on Canadian power. This was a calculated move, designed to hit back where it would be felt most. Yukon stopped buying American alcohol and restricted US companies from government contracts, even floating bans on Alaska's athletes and Trump Jr.'s hunting trips. These actions, though symbolic, sent a strong message of resistance and solidarity. The response was coordinated and diverse, from BC to Ontario to the Yukon. Each region found its own way to contribute, showing that every corner of the country was engaged in the fight. The message, an attack on one part of Canada, was an attack on all. This sense of unity was unprecedented, bringing together politicians, businesses, and ordinary Canadians. The strategy aimed to inflict targeted pain on US sectors, hoping to create political pressure on Trump. By focusing on key American industries, Canada hoped to force a change in US policy. It was a high-risk, high-reward approach, escalating the dispute into a full-blown confrontation. The stakes were high and the outcome uncertain. Both sides dug in, preparing for a protracted economic battle. Negotiations grew tense, and the world watched as the two neighbors faced off. National unity became Canada's greatest weapon. The country's resolve was tested, but Canadians stood firm, determined to protect their way of life. The trade war was no longer just about tariffs, it was about national resolve. In the end, it was Canada's spirit of togetherness that would define its response to the crisis. The trade war's impact was immediate at the border, once a symbol of friendship, now a barrier. A Leger poll showed 36% of Canadians cancelled US trips in protest, a grassroots boycott, not a government order. Border crossings plummeted, with February 2025 seeing the lowest numbers since the pandemic. American border towns and tourist destinations felt the pinch as Canadian visitors vanished. Retailers in Buffalo and Bellingham and snowbird hotspots like Florida braced for a tough season. The boycott hit small businesses and tourism operators hardest, many with no say in the politics. On the Canadian side, the threat to BC's cruise industry loomed, risking the loss of nearly 2 million passengers. Anxiety and uncertainty gripped businesses, making planning nearly impossible. The conflict turned vacations and cross-border trips into casualties of a spiraling trade war. Ordinary people paid the price for political brinkmanship. The trade dispute's reach extended far beyond tolls and tourism, chilling business across countless sectors. Uncertainty led companies to pause investments and rethink supply chains, slowing economic activity even before tariffs hit. Canadian boycotts of US goods spread, with provinces like BC halting imports from Republican-led states. Buy Canadian movements gained traction. deepening commercial division. US farmers and manufacturers faced new tariffs, threatening jobs and revenue in key districts. The intricate web of cross-border supply chains built over decades was at risk of unraveling. Economists warned a prolonged trade war would mean higher prices, lost jobs, and no winners, only mutual pain. The destinies of Canada and the US were more entwined than ever, despite the rhetoric. Amid political threats, ordinary citizens along the border worked to preserve personal connections. Citizen diplomacy flourished, small acts to maintain friendships despite the storm. The Buckwheat International Ski Classic straddling BC and Alaska went ahead with Canadians and Americans racing together. Participants wore national colors, not in anger, but in pride and hope for peace. The event was filled with camaraderie, shared food, and open conversations about the conflict. These grassroots efforts reminded all that the relationship was built on more than trade. It was about shared lives. Citizen diplomacy offered a counterbalance to official hostility, keeping lines of communication open. The enduring goodwill between Canadians and Americans hinted at hope for reconciliation. The crisis brought both nations to a crossroads, with immense risks on both sides. For the US, a prolonged dispute threatened Alaska's access and a vital trading partnership. For Canada, the stakes were even higher. Jobs and industries depended on US markets. Canadian leaders faced the challenge of defending sovereignty without triggering catastrophe. Quiet diplomatic efforts began behind the scenes, seeking a way to de-escalate. The goal, a face-saving solution for both Trump and Canada, protecting economic interests. Negotiations were delicate, but they offered hope for avoiding disaster. Ultimately, the strength of the US-Canada relationship lay with its people, not just its leaders. Citizen diplomacy and shared values provided a foundation for recovery. The hope remained that goodwill and pragmatism would prevail, restoring the world's most successful partnership.